Man is God's brother. You are a divine being. You matter. You count. You come from realms of unimaginable power and light, and you will return to those realms.
Hello everybody. So this is my first trip experience with psilocybin, but of my second trip, which I did on February 24th with a uni friend of mine a couple of days after my 23rd birthday. The first I did with my brother over the Christmas holiday, but it was very, very, very nuanced. I could talk extensively about that one, but I'd like to focus on this second, more potent and significant episode. So as a provisional note, experiment with a psychedelic, if of course you haven't already. You're clearly interested in the nature of the experience if you're here, and there's nothing comparable to direct experience when seeking to understand anything. Language, even the most eloquent, will only take you so far, and for the round trip to complete an insight, you have to don a psychonautical suit. So as a disclaimer, mood, congruency, memory. 3 words to mean that whatever I may strive to recall and articulate to you, it shall forever be a mere aspiring facsimile to what I actually experienced. A psychological term which denotes the phenomenon that your mood affects your memory. So the closer the mood you're in when remembering to the mood you were in when experiencing, the better your remembering is going to be. Thus, the state I was in under the influence of psilocybin was quite a profoundly distinct one to the one I'm presently in, so my memory can never hope to really resurrect that original experience. So I studied neuroscience for my degree, so I've always been fascinated by psychoactive compounds, how physical molecules can profoundly influence your mind, especially psychedelics. For the last couple of years, I've been yearning to try psychedelics. Not purely for recreation and not purely for mere curiosity, but as a neuro student, to have what I knew to be the imperative other side of the story. One that isn't available in a lecture theatre. Experiential understanding to offer insight to the intellectual knowledge and vice versa. I knew there to be plethoric evidence suggesting the alleviation of depression, anxiety disorders, including obsessive compulsive, addiction, alcohol, nicotine, by academics like David Nutt, Robin Carhart-Harris at Imperial, Roland Griffiths, who's at Johns Hopkins, who has done very, very significant paper on the occasioning of mystical type experiences just from the use of psilocybin. Charles Grove, who's at UCLA, who's the first, I believe, to do psilocybin clinical studies on cancer patients so to alleviate their natural existential distress and anxieties. So just an example, Bill Wilson, who's the co-founder of Alcoholics Anonymous, was cured of alcoholism by lysergic acid diethylamide, LSD, acid, and establishing Alcoholics Anonymous with that in mind. Most of all, I wanted to change. I considered them a potential magic bullet which will melt my current mind away and reconstruct it afresh. And this was the perfect time in my life before big decisions to experiment with it. I was essentially impeded by fear of it compromising my mental health versus improving it, i.e. becoming psychotic. Despite exciting recent evidence and knowledge that for every one case of psychotic episodes you hear after a psychedelic trip, which burns in your memory, there are hundreds of thousands of deaths per year ascribed to smoking and alcohol left unspoken. 20% over 35s in England in 2009. Those deaths were attributed to smoking and alcohol. 20% over 35s in England in 2009. So, psilocybin and LSD are, by dimensions of social and personal harm, the very least harmful psychoactives which are generally used. That is, versus alcohol and nicotine, for instance, the legal, most commonly used, celebrated, which are themselves amongst heroin and cocaine. These psychedelics are sometimes dubbed as psychotomimetic. It didn't sound too promising to me, but later, encouragingly, encountering Timothy Leary's quote, psychosis has been known to be induced in those who have not taken psychedelics. That, to me, was a very pertinent, serendipitous encounter with that quote to kind of quell those fears of mine. The month preceding my first trip, almost every other day I was researching psychedelics. Trip report videos, forum discussions, quotations, celebrity cases, reading The Doors of Perception by Aldous Huxley, Food of the Gods by Terence McKenna, listing and documenting abstracts of scientific papers published about anything remotely to do with psychedelic research. I researched David Nutt's work and Landira Fernandez's work, which was on ayahuasca in Brazil for some of my uni exams and some of my presentations. I hoped I might be the person who did the most reading up and preparation for their first trip, honestly. Ultimately, the trip was so subtle, so nuanced, that there was an element of deflation, but one predictable due to taking such a low dose. It was about 7 grams of Mexicana truffles, which I drank in hot chocolate, which I thought to be the most respectful and kind of quasi-ceremonious way I could potentially do it, in adherence to how it was originally done by the Mesoamericans when they would traditionally take psilocybin. They'd do it with chocolate and often in a chocolate brew. So in essence, perfect for an initial step, really, towards several further anticipated experiences. So this time I went to Aberdeen, I went back to Aberdeen, which is my university, and I went to a lovely river and forest right on the seaside. It was Seaton Park, which was very, very curiously mirroring of the first time I was there, to be honest, which was just intriguing aside, which is totally unplanned. I used Pajaritos truffles for my second time, and we initially did, so I was with one friend of mine, we initially did a third each of it, of the 15 grams, and so we had a little left over. So the important thing is we smoked a bit of marijuana beforehand, so we were also high on weed, and throughout the trip's entirety I could never really be sure which drug to attribute whatever my given experience was to, which was confounding, but it was rather playful. So firstly, I was extremely proud of myself for so casually not only doing the truffles rather spontaneously after about a 2-month hiatus for my mental preparation, and actually mixing them with weed, after some unfortunate past experiences and bad trips while mixing Salvia divinorum with weed, which I utterly do not recommend. So naturally, if it had gone awry, in hindsight, I'd not be proud, but rather regretful, but it did not go awry. So we set out, very, very good buddy of mine, Thomas, and the Pajaritos type of truffles was highly recommendable to do socially. So we were also very importantly within nature, which I completely highly suggest. It was a Scottish coast, beautiful environment. So we were pleasantly walking for a good 45 minutes or so. And the first sign was quite strong visceral pain. And 95% of your serotonin actually is within your enteric nervous system, so that nervous system which innervates your digestive tract. And of course, if you don't know, psychedelics fundamentally act upon your serotonin neurotransmission system, the 5-HT2A receptor. I'd expected more of a psychological reaction by now, which was about an hour in, and I commented to my mate that I was pretty certain it would be pretty mild. So we both took the last third to complete the packet. And typically one of the first signs is laughter or giggling. And that, of course, started to happen to us. From a constant beaming smile to moments of hysterical laughter at seemingly inane observations or thoughts. What eventually transpired was a gradual transformation into a laughter-brimming, prolifically conversational sojourn together. A happy, contemplative walk with a friend. So this does paint a rather tranquil picture, but I think to clarify the effects of the simultaneous weird, I was rather manic in my disposition also, which is not unlike me when tripping or anything I've done so far. But it was jovial rather than more like frantic, I think, like passionately articulating my every thought, my spinning snowballing thoughts while really tripping over myself a lot. That is verbally, not literally. So at one point we sat on a log on the beach, looking out at a lovely scene, commented by my friend as unbelievably Scottish. Overcast skies, oil tankers, half-buried shopping trolley in the sand, and a bloke walking his dog. I was gazing out at a crowd of bathing seagulls, and honing tightly in on them, attempting to empathise with the best of my imagination a day in the life of a seagull. Musing how it was a tragedy that these creatures are always surrounding us, yet how many individuals have truly focused on the birds, to try to become the bird, to realise deeply that they are organisms, they're living beings, with a form of communication, a form of culture, lives of their own, forever dismissed as inconvenient sky vermin. They're not appreciated as the complex, beautiful beings I truly felt them to be in that moment. Naturally, normally these thoughts are snuffed out in favour of their incessant squawking or sandwich thieving. While thinking about this, I started to realise that the Truffles were patently affecting my thought processes now, engendering focus, empathy, eloquence. I closed my eyes for a while, immediately realising some perceptual effects were taking place also. Subtle, yet pretty geometric patterns emerged. Colourful strings of light in repeating forms. I thought I could see the faintest impression of a dragon head. It was extremely discreet, nothing close to popular psychotropic images of kaleidoscopic geometric fractals, much like the blotchy colours that you can see if you shut your eyes really tight, but with a more obvious form and fractal-like. It was tremendously pleasant. Bizarre. This was the characterising word uttered by my friend Thomas, perfectly encapsulating the whole experience. This is bizarre, he said. Of course, I bowl over in laughter to convey my total concurrence with this sentiment. The word is so appropriately reminiscent of concocted dream worlds like Alice in Wonderland or Dark City, if you've ever seen that film, which was allegedly an inspiration for the Matrix trilogy, with Rufus Sewell's, one of my absolute all-time favourite films. Massively recommend Dark City, where the way you think of the world, i.e. how everything appears to you, takes on a strange quality. It's just not the same as you left it. As if your previous perceptions were some rigid, stagnated distortions. Something's going on here, in this universe, that has not been tapped into. This was essentially the sentiment. Or at least it certainly has been tapped into. I haven't certainly tapped into it until this point, potentially. These are the kinds of ideas. I was simply flooded with new philosophical perspectives on the potential machinations of the universe. One of my distinct most memories is standing by... So this is a very, very, very epicentral image and scene from my experience. So standing by an old fallen tree in the forest. And the forest floor already colonising at its base. And it was sublime. I just looked at it in perfect stillness and awe. And I walked until my nose was about half an inch away from its uprooted roots, and I gazed into the minutiae of the soil, the stones, the hundreds of layers of humus, and commented, "This is gorgeous. Tom, this is gorgeous." I was still prodigiously reeling off thought after meta-thought after meta-thought to Tom. To which, after every break in my remembering it more vividly now. So to which every break in my proclamations, his eyes would periodically bulge out of his sockets, as if repeatedly slapped in the face by some thought bomb, some philosophical Hiroshima that just landed on his head. It was hilarious, hysterical, and I just continued to do it at my sheer leisure for quite some time. So this tree episode was an especially poignant one. It was probably what I found to be the deep most amusing that I had. Everything is a narrative. This was something inspired by something my brother said to me just days before. Sorry, this was something inspired that my brother said to me just days beforehand. So it's not my own. It's my brother's locution. And it appeared I was having an epiphany at that moment to epitomise and to vindicate that exact sentiment. Tom had commented that it was so perfectly placed for us to walk by it, and maybe to choose to sit on it. And I like this idea. And I ensued to personify the tree, just joking as if it was speaking through me, saying, "Damn! These boys need a fucking bench!" And so it lays down its life for us. And at this crude, ostensibly really silly, exaggerated concept, which we laughed about a great deal at the time, my mind seemed to just spiral into a cascade of weighty, seemingly paradoxical, impossible notions. Namely that the universe is a beatific, supreme entity that I characterised as female, not coincidental to our natural context, who is so omnipotent in her sheer ability that she acts precisely akin to authors or scriptwriters within humanity as constructor and narrator of all the sequences of infinitesimal events in the playing out of the cosmos. She was a very real living being, analogous to earthly beings, who was a screenplay writer of sorts, but for the universe, and us, her characters, each and every one a protagonist at the epicenter of their every individual first-person experience, just as significant as the other. And who, contrasted to the characters us humans spin stories of lacking any real experience, consciousness, lives, do indeed possess a consciousness. She had, as it were, reached through time, as it appears to us as beings deprived of access to the fourth dimension, so as to very deliberately contrive that this tree before us had fallen exactly as it had, for the prime purpose of being there at exactly the moment of our passing it. And this magnificent, Gaia-like entity is simultaneously so loving that she would design such an event just for the sheer simple pleasure and conviviality for two young men walking together in her forest to use as a bench, if they so chose. For such is her power and such is her love, because it is simply what she does. And on similar lines, I projected my mind back to a Joe Rogan podcast, and if you don't know Joe Rogan, you've got to know Joe Rogan. Incredible being. At least check out his podcast, one of the most popularly downloaded podcasts in history, I think. And he had a recent podcast with a psychologist in Canada called Jordan Peterson, and Jordan ensued to work out on the spot that Joe Rogan is probably the most successful interviewer on the planet, and therefore in history, given the prolific number of interviews that he does weekly and forever, and how long that he's been doing it, and how many downloads that he gets a year. That was the calculations. Just one of my favourite podcasts of all time to listen to. So I project my mind back to this one podcast of his I listened to some days before with Duncan Trussell, a comedian and friend of his, and entertaining the concept that ideas themselves could have consciousness. And this blew my mind. So in entering my head, I had no choice but to ride the coalescing brainwave to its logical conclusion. To what new mindscape can this idea take you? I asked myself. I was convinced that there may be a property of fractal consciousness. That this omnibenevolent universal being's mind is so potent, has so much gravity, as it were, that their very ideas, those motes of consciousness which comprise it, are very much conscious also. But since they are the boundlessly divisible progeny of this one mind, they are not nearly as conscious, if that makes sense. So we are ultimately at once independent conscious agents, yet simply the various manifestations of ideas swirling colourfully around the mind of this gorgeous cosmic giant. And similarly, the corollary of this is that the ideas which we humans possess cannot indeed be conscious things. Thus, as we scale down and down and down in this consciousness begetting consciousness begetting consciousness concept, our ideas are consciousness-less. And equally, as we scale back up, the rationale implies that there may well be beings transcendent and extra cosmic enough that they themselves have precipitated our own Mother Universe itself. If you follow this pattern of understanding. Another curious musing as we strolled down the forest path was the consideration of myself and all others as mere machines, in that we are, in fact, artificial intelligences. This is a thought I've had many times before, but characteristic of the Psilocybin experience, it yanks your thoughts and draws from the plasma of your mind more and more parallel thoughts and embellishes the original, accumulating layer by layer until that thought is bodied, fleshed out more than it will ever typically become in regular consciousness. Granted, we're not AI in the sense as we recognise it, man-made and probably silicon-based digital software running on robotic hardware, but to poeticize the term emoticon, we are artificial in that we were created and we were made, be it by a grand designer or processes of evolution, or both, since of course I do not believe they are mutually exclusive possibilities. And we are intelligent. If we, all animals, in fact, can be considered forms of AI, then we may empathise with the current progresses and movements of AI as we see it evolve today. And I hope you see the exemplar compatibility with design and evolution there. I.e., the becoming exponentially clever and more capable. I viewed myself in that moment as an AI person. As I was taking in my surroundings, in dialogue with another AI person, my friend Tom here, and powerfully introspecting, I just toyed with the idea that I was like a toy. But a biological mechanism which eventually became conscious, developed consciousness or was imbued with consciousness. And I was that biomachine, unhindered by the eons of subtle, conscious evolution, able to freshly imagine my once being a lesser automaton, as compared to my present, greatly aware and deeply introspective, inquisitive self. I wondered if this is precisely what one of our artificial creations might experience. And maybe somebody beat us to the punch already. Most interestingly, however, I don't think I was too impressed with my level of consciousness. I viewed myself and humans at large, though the alleged zenith of animal consciousness, as a mere lowly step in the cosmic game of conscious evolution. I envisage myself as only an exquisitely sophisticated piece of mechanistic art, seeing pistons and gears, portrayals of the neuronal and synaptic gadgetry of our brain, churning in my mind's eye, phenomenally generating an emergent mind. It made me somewhat despondent that we were just lumbering robots, to quote Dawkins, and our calibre of awareness was a glimpse of what could potentially be. But perhaps we can hope to transcend this monkey mind, as dubbed by Buddhist philosophy, and become souls, superseding of their base counterparts. As a neurostudent, it is fascinating, during and in reflection, to analyse how it is that this compound has affected my own mind, how cognition has been tampered with. For instance, reason was in some large way left intact at times. It was something I was extremely grateful for in the moment, both being able to experience careering, snowballing thoughts, and no sooner had they precipitated to also freeze on my tracks, and to look back to the path etched out in my mind by these runaway thought trains, and put my foot down at last to ask aloud, Pag, wait! Let's think about it! Is this possible? Can the universe possibly, feasibly function like this? So to use some crude pseudo-neuroscientific ideas with kernels of truth, just to illustrate the point, my right, intuitive, flexible, creative, emotional, female, visuospatial, symbolic, parallel operating brain suddenly enjoyed transient disinhibition by my dominating oppressive left, linguistic, egoistic, male, linear, logical, analytical, numeric, serial operating brain. So my cognition was unconstrained, free to follow every vague notion to their logical or illogical fruition down this rabbit hole, while moments later still retain sufficient faculties to stop the press and review exactly what I apparently just came up with. Like playing peekaboo with sanity and his intimate sister insanity. So in the midst of formulating these seemingly profound ideas, I would be convinced of the drug enabling my unstitching of cosmic truth of all. And moments later I'd shut up, take a minute to absorb what I just heard myself say, as I'd usually spit it aloud to Tom, and question everything I'd just been so compelled by. It was a fantastic exchange, really fantastic, that I was extremely grateful for. So psilocybin has an important effect on language. I believe it's Gaussian. It's a bell curve when comparing dosage and eloquence, most probably. A good friend of mine once described his psilocybin trip by first exclaiming how it was the first time he'd ever felt language was an obstruction. The mystical experience is by criteria an ineffable one. That is, it is by definition defying of linguistic explanation, and it transcends the wordy realm. My first trip was a very modest dose, and I happened to feel that language certainly became impedimentary. I was forever struggling to find apt words and fumbling over the ones I'd selected. The flight of ideas could not catch up with the mechanics of forming speech. And simultaneously, with heavy doses, the brain is in such a novel, reconstructed, entropic state that language, as do many other cultural psychological constructs, appears to dissolve away into a conceptual black hole. There are likely other means of linguistic failure too, being wrapped in sheer awe of that which you are seeing or feeling, so there's not even time or will to construct a sentence. However, my experience this time was prodigiously linguistic. When not in awe of this or that, I was almost in perpetual word flow. My mind and mouth operating as a well-oiled system, lips only milliseconds behind thoughts, where I'd monologue articulating bouts of ideas, prolific and with such passion, despite the ideas themselves being convoluted, yet with their own alluring, warped logic. And I'd gauge my friend's facial expression to intimate my being either an utter nut or some kind of psychonautic messiah. Technically, the drug has incredibly been proved to impact the brain much like meditation. a meditative crash course, if you will, to quieten the mind and to dampen the relentless internal chatter. There are distinct circuits which are silenced in both instances, meditation and psychedelic experience, notably the DMN, or default mode network, which is essentially comprised of the ventromedial prefrontal cortex and the posterior cingulate cortex. So in this way, the linguistic, conscious, self-narrating left brain is hushed and selfless. Wordless bliss can thenceforth germinate. Terence McKenna also believed that mushrooms facilitated in human evolution amongst brain growth, out competition, agriculture, and even religion, the development of language. So, as touched on already quite a lot, the substance's ability to precipitate a full-bodied thought is uncanny. During the trip, I realised to adore the expression for thoughts to crystallize in one's mind, since the imagery of the physical crystallization of a thought, first starting life as a speck of carbon aggregates, building up to a fully realized crystal diamond-like lattice megastructure, is such a telling one. This is precisely how it felt. A thought physically grows, gathering its own momentum and gravity and pulling subsidiary ideas to it to feed into its bulk until the gorgeous product may allow the light to beam through it. This is exceptionally important for shrooms' evident amplifying effect on creativity. Once you conceive of an idea, you run with it, and it takes on a life of its own. This is the crux of the creative process, I think. The cannabis, I think, should also be credited somewhat for this. Since a mechanism of the THC in the cannabis is to inhibit the inhibitory neuronal current, usually serving as a periodic blockade of the neuronal impulse. So thus the action potentials in your neuronal cell are maintained. Psychologically, having the corollary of the idea staying with you longer. The fascinating neuroscience of what psilocybin not only fosters creativity, but counteracts depression, anxiety, and addiction, etc., is likely that it shuts down this default mode network, which is a resting state network which acts to funnel neuronal activation through the most efficient pathways. So brain activity is literally forced to go around the houses to explore novel neuronal pathways, and the brain-mind interface is engaged in a much more global communication. Regions which are typically secluded now open a new dialogue together. And it must be the brain basis for the more flexible thinking and unprecedented perspectives, open-mindedness, even epiphanies that one can have on psychedelics, which then contributes to the optimizing of one's mental well-being. Memory was a very funny thing too. Again, I'm basically clueless as to what substance was actually responsible, although it's far more likely to be the psilocybin because I didn't have that much weed beforehand, to be honest. But as torrential as much of my thought process were, much of the time I would simply forget what I'd said at the very start. The sentences being too strung together and tangential. So this was always a source of hilarity, really. Utterly losing track and looking at each other blankly, just lost for words and in hysterics. That was likely the marijuana, to be honest. So THC acts on cannabinoid receptors, not actually of neurons, but of the glia, the glial cells, such as the astrocytes, and it induces long-term depression, and therefore inhibits and working memory processes. That is shown within mice samples. So basically, why you forget shit when you're on dope. So that I would attribute to the THC, whereas the vast majority of the rest certainly attributable to the psychedelics. One spectacular episode was when ambling by the river, and as I peered to my left, I see two crows. on the bank, spaced apart, and framing one swan. The sheer sight of it actually brought me to my knees, in an immediate conviction of its symbolic significance. Yet another example, this time farcically transparent it seemed, of everything being a narrative, i.e. the motions of the universe very purposefully and meaningfully being by design to tell us a story, to tell a story to its beneficiaries. I hear stories and read mythologies about symbolic events in nature, and now it seems to be happening to me. Each of these birds are replete with mythologies and symbolism. For instance, the swan, associated with self-transformation, and with love, beauty, or grace, with emotions, with light, and with the soul. All extremely pertinent symbols for what I was experiencing. The swan song derives from the Greek story of a singing swan to a lyre upon dying. Now meaning the very final act or farewell before one's death. It's associated with Venus and Aphrodite, the Roman and Greek respective goddesses of love, and Zeus metamorphosed to a swan when making love to Leda. Being an important water bird, it's linked with the balancing of emotions. In dream analyses, it supposedly represents the higher self, or the daemon. In alchemy, the marriage of opposites. The Germanic mythologic Valkyries took the form of swans and decided who may enter Valhalla. In one story, one sung to her lover as he battled in war, whereupon he simply lost the urge to fight. Crows are most often considered harbingers of death, being the carrions they are, including ravens and vultures. This need not be a macabre omen, but a message of spiritual profundity. Crow sightings have been correlated with episodes of death, to relay that the deceased have entered the spirit realm, or indeed are a direct communication of the spirit of the deceased incarnated into the bird. Part of the Corvidae, the family of birds they are, they're the most intelligent of birds, and studies showing them to have humanesque talents of lateral thinking and resourcefulness, impressive memory and foresight, and have a brain-body mass ratio actually close to humans, which is extremely significant. Thus, in lore, too, they're endowed with tremendous wisdom, with access to the spirit world, and peering through time, in fact. With their piercing black eyes, they see through your soul and into your true self. They're named synanthropic, which is further testimony to their mental prowess, as rather than being endangered by human domination, they actually thrive due to their unparalleled adaptability. Hawking's criteria for intelligence, in fact, adaptation. So as such, they're a reminder of our adaptation, marking the time to change, to see our authentic self and to transform into it. Two ravens, as a closely related species, were the eternal insignia of Odin. Hugin and Munin, their names, which translate as thought and memory. And they would fly in opposite directions through space-time and report back to their father. Crows can epitomise second sight, shed our present range of vision, look beyond what we believe to be capable of, and to cultivate higher spiritual awareness. So what's all this got to do with myself and my friend? There are a string of interrelated themes common to both birds here: death, transformation, the soul, fundamentally. Three concepts which especially preoccupied my mind on a daily basis. We took a compound supposed to broaden consciousness, and we witnessed a picture of perhaps two of the most resplendently symbolic animals in nature of metamorphosis. One's higher self and spirituality. Most magnificently, just the day prior, Thomas had the body of his just passed close friend who he lived with, taken to the house to impart final goodbyes. I came up to celebrate Tom's own birthday, which was in a few days, and to offer some friendly moral support and condolences, an offering to the Truffles. An opportunity for a psychedelic, potentially healing experience, which we would then share. And we are presented with this exact configuration of birds to symbolize them as we will. It reminds me, I was reminded by Thomas, in fact, that his birthday was the very day before the day they always celebrated this friend's triumph over death, the day that he in fact had a paralysing accident. So thus, for years, they rejoiced side by side, Tom's being born and his not dying, which is beautiful in and of itself. Yet his friend ensues to die that very same week, and we ensue to observe this angelic message during a psychedelic experience. At the appreciation of this, I was utterly stunned and lolled in a bout of incredulous amazed laughter at the weavings of the universe. I was preoccupied at the time with the intense contemplation that all souls are fundamentally a different manifestation of a singular soul. And it has to do with time, the illusion of separate minds being a trick of our incarceration by linear temporal perception. And I voiced this to Tom. Perhaps there is no death of his friend. The two of them, and perhaps indeed myself, the rest of sentient life, are one and the same conscious entity. The difference now merely being a change in the recycling of this conscious mind. To which he responded, well, if it means that David is still alive somewhere, then... And then I replied, he may be closer than you think. Not purely by you, or in you, but you! Incidentally, the Mahabharata, in Kava Parva, section 41, tells a very interesting tale of a crow and a swan. It is an allegory within a story, where the narrator is regaling a prince with this fable, as a warning message of morality against folly. Essentially, the crow is portrayed as arrogant, has been deceived to believe he's the greatest of all birds, and so challenges the swan to an aerial show of prowess in flight. The crow soars wildly in intricate aerobatics, while the swan glides in perfect grace. The crow, betrayed by his own hubristic zeal, meets inevitable nemesis, falls from the sky in exhaustion, and pleased to be rescued by the swan and taken back home. The swan looks on in compassion, takes him upon his back to safety, and garners some food for him to be restored. Now, that's just an incidental little interesting story from the Vedas, the Hindu Vedas, which involves a swan and a crow. But that is the end for me just now, because I have failed to write a good second and final half of my experience. So hopefully you have enjoyed this first half, and hopefully I will get round to finishing up the second half. But it's very likely that there may well be another trip report of this, an analysis of this sort of a further psilocybin experience that I might have soon before I get the chance to write up this one. Thank you very much.